And I want to turn now to close things off to the story of Ukraine. As I mentioned, Matt Ho refers to the European plan to gin up a war economy as military Keynesianism. He calls it military Keynesianism, which is exactly right. I'd like to present to you a key conversation between Judge Napolitano and Aaron Mate, whose coming new book looks at the U.S. involvement in Ukraine for the past 3 decades and exposes the U.S. machinations to overthrow Yanukovych in late 2013, early 2014. This exchange offers very valuable dovetails to the current situation and to much of what we've mentioned about the history of Ukraine when we discuss it on Liberty Conspiracy Live. I'll also mention this before we even go to that. Merz is complaining that the German economy is faltering because they don't have enough energy. And I said, Merz and company put Germany in that situation within NATO and the EU, and they perpetuate the problem, thinking they can, as if by magic, have a productive economy based on militarism. This is why economics and geopolitics are so connected, because they think they can control their economies, and then they continually tie these things to overthrow of governments, resource theft, and setting up proxy governments. Productive gains for living standards are not increased by diverting resources away from where market participants can decide to devote those resources. So this is all in German, but you can see, he says, energy crisis continues due to the lack of Russian gas. Gee whiz, really? Thanks for the big breakthrough, buddy. Why are you lacking Russian gas? Let's go to Aaron Mate. This is great. His new book is going to be excellent.
2026, after a 2-week break, I'm happy to welcome back my friend Aaron Mate. Aaron, a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we get to Senator Lindsey Graham's bipartisan appeal when it comes to war, do you have an understanding about the basis for the media in the West claiming that Ukraine is on the cusp of some sort of a victory against Russia?
The same basis they've had to repeat the same line for years, even though the reality on the ground was far different. Recall that in the summer counteroffensive of 2023, 3 years ago, and then the incursion into Kerch inside Russia 1 year later, the line was exactly the same, that Ukraine's on the march, Russia is defeated. And in fact, this is the line we've been hearing ever since Ukraine walked away from the Istanbul peace talks under US-UK pressure back in 2022, because you need that narrative to keep the war going, to manufacture public consent for funneling tens of billions of dollars in new NATO weaponry into this war, rather than promoting diplomacy. So we're getting it now, and the new craze is that Ukraine supposedly inflicting serious damage on Russia by launching these long-range drone strikes. And again, it's the same pattern. These strikes have embarrassed Vladimir Putin and his government. They have. Putin's tried to project normalcy throughout this war. He's avoided, for example, a forced mobilization. He's tried to give an impression that things are normal. And when you have these strikes hitting gas stations and long lineups for gas and people going through power outages in Crimea, it does puncture that. But the war, again, is not being fought in a narrative. It's being fought on the battlefield. And what's happening there? Russia is continuing the same progress it's made throughout this war, a very slow advance. And I think people in the West have a hard time understanding the strategy behind it. But Russia's simply waiting it out, using the fact that it has a much bigger population, a more efficient industrial process to produce weapons, to wait out the Ukrainians, to wait out the NATO patrons, and take more and more territory slowly on the ground in a war of attrition that favors the bigger side, which has always been the case. So we've seen this before. I mean, like, recall with Operation Spider's Web a year ago when Ukraine really humiliated Russia by launching this surprise drone attack, using drones that they were smuggled, that were smuggled into trucks to launch a wave of drone strikes on Russia's nuclear triad. That was embarrassing. But did it change the course of this war? No. So these drone strikes, it's the latest craze that Western proxy warriors can latch onto to make themselves feel good about continuing this war by shunning diplomacy, funneling more weapons into Ukraine. But it's not changing the reality on the ground.
Is there any significance, or do we even care about the firing of the Ukrainian defense minister?
Well, it speaks to something Zelensky's had to deal with for a very long time, which is managing different sources of power inside his government, which is always favored, by the way, the radical ultra-nationalists, including people who threaten to kill him. But in this case, you have a young defense minister who supposedly, and this is the reputation, I'm actually not sure it's true, but supposedly he stood up to corruption in the ranks with so much procurement benefiting well-connected people. And apparently that was a factor behind his firing. But there's also an overlooked fact here, which is simply that there's been so much Western hype around this drone campaign because it's embarrassing Russia. And this defense minister was a big proponent of that. But again, the fight is being waged on the ground. And perhaps Zelensky just wanted a defense minister who was more, who's better versed in a ground war, which Ukraine is losing, rather than these drone strikes, which get a lot of Western hype, but don't change much on the ground when it comes to the actual fight.
But
I
Russia
just
continues its slow.
I just want to pause this here because, again, this is so far away. It can seem so abstract, but you and I know lead is flying and drones are flying and people are being killed and houses are being burned and crops are being destroyed. And, it hopefully it doesn't sound too saccharine or anything like that. And there can be a certain amount of frustration because, what can I do about it or whatever. But I think that a circle of friends being able to discuss these things, it's a very, very important thing to acknowledge the nobility and the honorable struggle of people to try to get the truth out about some of these bad guys. And like I said, when I was reporting on this in 2013 and my friend came up to me to talk about the fact that he had come from the Obama administration and he was aware of what I was saying. And then he said, you're right, you're on the right track. That was a big deal. And let me show you what Aaron's got to say about that time period.
Inexorable march westward, and nobody can really dispute that.
Yeah, it's not disputed. There have been attempts to claim that Ukraine has pushed Russians back in some areas. Maybe that's true. But overall, if you look at the trajectory of this war, it's been a slow Russian advance that Ukraine has been unable to stop, and just a series of public relations exercises to get the public to think differently. The time when Ukraine was best placed to consolidate its actual battlefield victories was the fall of 2022. That's when Ukraine did actually have some significant victories on the ground, when they expelled Russian forces from Kherson and Kharkiv. That was a major, major victory for Ukraine. And that's when General Mark Milley came out and said, Ukraine should now consolidate its victories at the negotiating table. This is the time to negotiate. And there was a public spat about this. He went public. But who went out? It was Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Joe Biden, who didn't care about making peace. And they encouraged Ukraine to press even deeper. That's when they came up with the counteroffensive, which was a massive failure. In fact, even like inside the Pentagon, some officials have said that they don't even consider the Ukrainian counteroffensive to be a counteroffensive at all because it was such a failure. And the only issue there for the U.S. was that Ukraine was not sacrificing enough men. They were frustrated that Ukraine was hesitant to sacrifice its own people, and that's why they believe the counteroffensive failed, because Ukraine was too timid in pursuing it because they didn't want to lose so many people because they knew they would die. So that's where things are at. You have a series of public relations exercises to cover up for the underlying reality that Russia is winning a very slow grind on the ground.
I was going to raise this at the end of our interview, but your answers are so fascinating. You have a book coming out called Their Blood, Our Bullets, the hidden story of the U.S.-Russia war for Ukraine. There it is, and we'll keep that up for a minute. If you want to scan your mobile device there, you'll get right to OR Books, which is the publisher. I think this is pre-ordering. I don't know if it's actually out there. But you have done extraordinary research on the origins of all this and the continuation of all this, have you not?
I have, and yeah, the book is not out yet, but it's available for pre-order. You can go to orbooks.com, or my website, aaronmate.net, to pre-order a copy. And yeah, the book is the culmination of all the work I've been doing for the last decade on the proxy war in Ukraine, which does not begin with Russia's invasion of February 2022. It begins with the Maidan coup of February 2014. And there's a spillover effect where the
Do
U.S.
you have a scene where Mrs. Newland is out there passing out cookies?
Well, she is passing out sandwiches, but of course, she's not just passing out sandwiches to the Maidan protesters. She's also passing out millions of dollars,
right,
support to movements that ultimately helped overthrow Ukraine's democratically elected government and set off this whole crisis. And she also wasn't even just handing out, dollars to the opposition. She also was trying to hand out orders to the government that ultimately was overthrown with U.S. support, which is the government headed by Viktor Yanukovych, who was trying to stay neutral, who wanted to, deepen ties with the West, but he didn't want to bring Ukraine into NATO because Ukraine's own declaration of state sovereignty calls for Ukraine to be a permanently neutral state. And that was unacceptable to people like Victoria Nuland. So Nuland was trying to essentially order Yanukovych to abandon his pledge for neutrality and to adopt a series of, Western-backed economic reforms that would have isolated his own support base, which is the ethnic Russian population of the east of Ukraine. And Yanukovych refused Nuland's orders. And that's one of the reasons why he got overthrown, and one of the reasons why Victoria Nuland was caught on tape plotting about who should take his place, or at least who in the Ukrainian opposition should go into a power-sharing government with him, as part of a deal that the U.S. eventually helped sabotage anyway, because Yanukovych, to put an end to the Maidan protests, agreed to a power-sharing deal with the opposition, which after he agreed to, the opposition totally ignored and ousted him violently, which the U.S. turned around and cheered. And then all this has a spillover effect in the U.S. where, after a few years of fueling a coup in Ukraine and a proxy war there that begins after the coup, then you have Donald Trump come along, and Trump on the campaign trail in 2016 is talking about, wouldn't it be nice if we cooperated with Russia? And I don't want to go to World War III over Ukraine. So what does the Democratic Party establishment, including Victoria Nuland, do? They frame him as a Russian agent. And so the book basically tracks how you have the subversion of democracy in Ukraine also spills over to the subversion of democracy in the U.S. And both the Ukraine coup and Russiagate sort of have this mutually escalating dynamic where they lead to a worse situation in both countries and ultimately help lead to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because one of the lasting impacts of Russiagate was to totally criminalize diplomacy with Russia, fuel an escalation in Ukraine, incentivize Trump to send weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't even send before because he didn't want to further inflame the conflict that he helped begin. And when Biden comes back to power, Biden essentially encourages Zelensky to crack down on his main opposition, which is friendly to Russia, to shun the Minsk peace accords, which could have put an end to the war in the Donbass that began after 2014. And Biden also ignores Russia's efforts to address Russia's security concerns over the expansion of NATO and the U.S. sabotaging arms control treaties.
So I'm going to pause it there, and I just want to add this. On the domestic side of things, that later summer of 2016 was extremely important as Trump was running for office against Hillary Clinton. And we saw the so-called DNC hack, which was not a hack, it was a leak, at the simultaneous to the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act. They were pushing this narrative, which actually the narrative started around 2009 as the United States started to shift away from Russia because Russia had dropped a lot of long-term U.S. debt instruments after the American Recovery Act. And the United States wanted to isolate Russian energy exports, the Russian connection with Syria and Assad. So they started to try to overthrow Assad. And of course, they already got rid of Gaddafi in Libya for similar reasons, because Gaddafi was going to start up a monetary unit that would have put the dollar to shame. So in the summer of 2016, we see them utilizing this anti-Russian mentality, this mentality of Russian interference with the Seth Rich leak, then using that, giving the computers to CrowdStrike, run by a guy named Aperovich, who was on the Atlantic Council, the core for NATO. They get the computers, not the FBI. They claim, oh, the Russians hacked, which is utterly ridiculous. The information got to WikiLeaks because of Seth Rich, clearly, and exposed people like John Podesta and exposed people like Hillary Clinton and the then vice chair of the Democrat Party, who had been feeding questions from the CNN debates to Hillary Clinton to favor her rather than Bernie Sanders. All that comes out of the DNC simultaneous to the summer of 2016, 10 years ago, when they were pushing the NDAA to include the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act that then feeds so many of these news and cozy news corporate industry hacks to start feeding us the government lines on things like Ukraine, on things like the COVID stuff, the lockdowns, the jabs, all those things. They're all then tied into what they leveraged off of the Portman-Murphy Countering Foreign Propaganda Act for 2 years. And then they recycled it and brought it back in when Biden was president, and they continued to push it. It got dropped for 2 years when Trump was in there, and then they brought it back. So all these things, whether you're concerned about the COVID jab stuff or the NewsGuard thing or the way that they were getting backdoors to Facebook to maybe stifle your speech, or going after people on Twitter and paying them $3.5 million when Jack Dorsey was in charge and the FBI was working with them, they're all connected. Every part of this is connected. And I never thought that, my journalism for MRC TV would be targeted, but it was. You're writing an article, you don't know that there are these giant blimps of deep state monsters out there that are going to somehow find out about your stuff and then come after you, right? So kudos to Aaron Mate for doing that, and I'm going to be picking up that book because that's going to be one heck of a great book. And I'll see if I can contact the publishing company, and maybe Aaron will be doing interviews and stuff. I know his time must be super, super limited, but I would love to be able to chat with Aaron Mate. By the way, I got a nice response from the folks at the 10th Amendment Center, and Michael Bolden will be on with us when he has the opportunity. And yes, Bronx Stomper, exactly, Bronx Stomper guard, but explain Guccifer 2.0. He's laughing. That's exactly it. That was their narrative. And I heard Billy Ray talking about Guccifer, and I actually put into, I think, the Rumble chat at the time, that explanation, because the whole Guccifer thing was a narrative cooked up by CrowdStrike and the people at the Atlantic Council and the people working with the DNC. That's exactly what it was. And again, you can see how they use the Ukrainian narrative and the Russians responding to the Ukrainians as, well, the Russians are aggressive. They're influencing things. It's Guccifer 2.0. Guccifer was this little blip started by a couple guys. Had nothing to do with anything. It's sort of like when they say that the Russians were influencing the elections, and then they cite like a $4,000 purchase of ads on Facebook. It's like, no, I'm sorry. Your concern is completely out of proportion. That's a boogeyman. That's a front so that you'll be distracted by what's really going on over here. It's ledger domain. So yeah, very good stuff. Thank you everybody for the kind thoughts, by the way, about the great mind meld, says SMU Smuhosky. Thank you guys. Great, really interesting stuff. I greatly appreciate you being here. And now, I've got more. I wanted to play a little segment of Karen Kwiatkowski, as Karen mentions a little bit of what we were discussing last night about the SAVE Act and how that would be very clearly unconstitutional. I'll play this just real quick before we go.
You are a world-class shrink. Why would Trump spend 25 minutes on national television relitigating the 2020 election instead of explaining what the hell he's doing now in 2026?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you know, the weird thing about it was when he was leading up in the days leading up to his 30-minute talk, he was all excited. He was trying to pump it up, like, hey, it's going to be really great. What you're going to hear is going to be really great. And of course, you know, we need some good news. There's no doubt about that. And the Iran situation's out of control, or Ukraine is out of control. I mean, there's all kinds of things he could have talked about, domestic issues. And he chose the one thing that I think, honestly, at this point, means so little to most Americans. And I think it does mean a lot to Trump, because he really does. And again, this is how he kind of works for the deep state. Trump is interested in nationalizing the voting process, which to me, I don't know if Trump thinks of it this way, because I don't think he really knows what's in the Constitution. But to me, it is a problem of it's a Ninth and a 10th Amendment insult to do that. You know, the states are responsible for the process of voting. And if you think about how the territories and states added on, once we had the 13, you know, we kept growing and growing. These states didn't do things the same way. And some states that wanted to be, some territories that wanted to be states, like Wyoming, for example, Utah as well, they gave women the vote long before the women's suffrage movement gained followers and gained support. They gave women the vote because it served the interest of the states. And the other thing is, and Trump is right about this, and many people who complain about our strange voting system, you know, the lengthy mail-in ballots, the long voting periods, you know, all this. It is true that many states have screwed up system of getting votes. California comes to mind. But that's for Californians to solve. That is between the state and the people that live there, honestly. And
yep. And I'll just say again, so to provide a little bit of accentuation or differentiation, again, for Congress and the Senate, the vote can be influenced by the federal government. The states can come up with their rules, but Congress can supersede those. For the president, the choosing of the electors very clearly. And we put out the separate video based on last night's conversation about this. And, you know, at the end of it, I said, I'm sorry if people disagree with it. This is a great scholarly moment for people to take away something, to say, you know, this show is different. This show gives you something valuable that you can remember, and you can research it, and you can apply this in other instances. There's some good people like Karen Kwiatkowski, who's out there, a person who works a lot with the Mises Institute, who's saying it correctly. And I'll just amplify that and mention again, I'm sorry people don't like knowing the fact that the Constitution grants the states the powers to choose the method by which they will choose their electors to the Electoral College. But I'm just saying what's in the Constitution. Like I said, I've got no horse in this race, okay? But you'll see on the separate videos over on Rumble, somebody gives a thumbs down. It's this person, I think, because we're not a huge show, and hopefully we'll get a lot bigger because people will like the scholarship or whatever, the entertainment. But you know, why do you not like that? I don't understand. I don't understand why you don't like somebody presenting information. And we are open to you providing your opinions and your thoughts if you want to. But you've got to be willing to debate. You've got to be willing to present evidence and information yourself. And I even said, okay, if you do want me to try to get somebody else on, I'll try to do it. It's a strange phenomenon to experience that, but hopefully we're doing a lot of work, and we're building up for you, and you value it. I know we're getting close to the end of the month. I was just looking at it, I was like, oh man, we're behind on the donations and so on. But if you do value what we're doing, if you think that this is a different approach, please consider donating or anything like that. Subscribing over at the Substack, because this is something I think is a good thing to be doing, and hopefully we'll be able to continue it and get more of your input as well. That'll be great. So look, don't forget also, if there's a really cool place, a historical place in your area, and you want us to talk about it, send me some information if you want to come on and chat about it on the screen. I'd love to have you on. I might not ever be able to travel there, but love that sort of stuff. If you got books, then we'll talk about great writers and so on, favorite movies, television, and if you have any thoughts about the breaking news. We won't get that news cycle amnesia. We'll stay together. We'll hang out. So look, I better get going. But thank you, everyone, for hanging with me. And please tell your friends about the show. And we'll try to get to doing that midday show as well. I think that would be great. Maybe we can do interviews with people like Karen Kay. That would be awesome. We'll get even you on, perhaps, and we'll have a good time with that. So I'm going to leave you with our outro number 2. And I will be saying hi to you in David Knight's chat tomorrow for Wordsmith Wednesday. And we'll try to read one of those stories, one of those shorter stories that we mentioned on Friday. That'll be great. And don't forget, of course, thank you to everybody who already supports us. And my blessings to you. If you have anybody who needs prayer or anything like that, let us know. And remember that physics doesn't come from physics. It has to come from something metaphysical. So let's root each other on for the good fight. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.